What's up, everybody? Welcome into this week's first live. I'm excited to be back hanging out with you guys. And we have one of my favorite topics, which is a juror speaking out and discussing what the process was like for them in a very high profile trial. We were talking about the Delphi case, Richard Allen's case. One of the jurors went on a podcast, gave an interview. It's a two-part podcast. I think it's almost 2 hours of interview. We're going to take some clips from it, see what we can learn from this juror. What did they see? What did they hold out to be some of the most important evidence? How did they deal with some of the controversial issues in the case, like the confession, the bullet, the experts, and things like that? We're going to get into whether or not they were, a true crime fan before or after, and what their feelings were on all the lawyers. We get all sorts of information throughout this juror interview. It's going to be really interesting. I'm sure they're going to be people that agree with certain parts and disagree with certain parts, maybe like the podcasters, don't like the podcasters. Let's not let any of that get in the way of us watching, listening, and learning the decision maker or one of the decision makers in this process, how they saw things, because that matters. That's important, whether we agree or disagree with a juror's verdict. It's really important to see what they saw and realize they don't know everything that some people watching on the outside may know, but their verdict matters. And we hope that they followed the law and handled things appropriately, which we'll discuss if we see any issues that are coming to light based on any of their comments. So without any further ado, let's get to it. So the Murder Sheet podcast, let me make sure I got that right. Yes, Murder Sheet podcast is who did the podcast, got the juror on. I don't know them personally. I know there are people that really like them in the chat, people that really don't like them in the chat. I understand all that. But they did provide a really interesting, in-depth interview with this juror that we're going to have the privilege of listening to pieces of it from, to break down and see what we can learn as far as which parts of the trial were most important. And for someone like myself that was not in the courtroom, we had a lot of people on our podcast that some aired, some didn't air, that were in the courtroom, that were on both sides of this. I know a lot of the ones that ended up airing were on the side that they felt like there just wasn't enough, or there were some issues in this case. They didn't think that Richard Allen was legally guilty. Some even borderline on the maybe Richard Allen actually is innocent. I don't think that's where this podcast landed. One of the hosts is a journalist, one is a lawyer. But we are going to listen for the information here that we can get from one of the jurors. And right off the bat, they get into part of the jury selection process. And this juror said that she likes true crime, is not an avid watcher or listener, but would basically catch the documentaries at night once in a while. I found that to be interesting. But she didn't know a lot specifically about this case. And I found it really interesting that the juror questionnaires had information about Odinism on it. And that led this juror to think there was going to be more about Odinism in the trial, which I found that to be interesting for a lot of reasons. Like, if you're going to ask Odinism questions, which I can understand why the defense would wanted to get in there, because they were still trying to get it in a trial, number one. But number two, if you're the defense, maybe you didn't even have to say it or argue it, but it was in the jurors' minds a little bit that when you showed or talked about the crime scene, maybe if they knew anything about Odinism, or, if they were thinking about Odinism or had it on the line, it's a situation where, people say Murder Sheet is notorious for striking. Well, we're gonna make it our own here and discuss as much as we possibly can and add to it as much as we can, just playing a couple clips from it. I'll talk to them if they want to talk about it. It's no big deal. And if it's not monetized, that's fine too. Which we can deal with all that as it goes. So it was interesting that Odinism was even on the questionnaire from my perspective. She talked a little bit about how the prosecutor in jury selection made her feel more at ease than the defense attorneys. It felt like more of an interrogation with the defense attorneys. She liked the demeanor of the prosecutors generally better than the defense attorneys. She felt like the defense attorney specifically was, I don't know if condescending is the right word, but more like a little harsher, I think. And the prosecutor was more like getting on their level, making the process, because they were all nervous. It was all difficult. And the prosecutor kind of made it a process that was easier for them to kind of digest and deal with it. I did notice this with this juror, that she was talking and making comments that she had watched or listened to this podcast, this Murder Sheet podcast. And then with more context after the trial, she went back, she did some research. She was interested in what was going on online. And she said maybe she even dove a little too deep into Reddit. But she really appreciated the work that this podcast did. She thought they did a really good job. And she appreciated the work they did on the case. And she does talk about some misinformation that was out there from people not in the courtroom, from people saying things that just didn't happen. And so we'll get to some of that when we discuss it. Let's see what else we got here. She talked a little bit about how maybe Richard Allen had weird eyes or something, was looking at some of the jurors. And the podcaster said that, yeah, even when he looked in the gallery, sometimes it was creepy. She said that the juror said she tried not to kind of make eye contact for a long time with Richard Allen. She said some of the other jurors would make eye contact with him until he stopped making eye contact with her, or with them, I should say. She said she did not partake in that, but that regardless of what his eyes were like, she did not think that had anything to do with his guilt or innocence, which is good in my opinion. Let's see what else. She said she brought in a Polaroid camera, which I thought was interesting. You're not supposed to, obviously, or allowed to bring in cameras, take pictures, things like that. But she said she thought she'd be able to bring a Polaroid in because you can't post it online. And that was confiscated, so she wasn't able to bring that in every day. I thought that was interesting. She said she loved the bailiffs, not unusual. They talked about the process of being sequestered and groceries being delivered and how they, logistically what it was like for them to kind of set up and try to get meals together. They asked her specifically, was she aware of the media attention, which is going to be one of the first clips I want to play here, of her discussing what the media attention is like, and whether or not she knew about it. So let's take a listen.
At first was every other night we would go out to dinner and then eat in every other. And the places we would go for dinners, we did Longhorn. Let me think. There's a place around there called Hayes River, something like that. It's like a public house. I remember more of the lunches for some reason. The lunches were just like McAllister's. There was that Stonehouse restaurant, Panera, all that stuff. So pretty just generic Cheddar's.
Yeah, I was wondering, during the trial, were you aware of the level of media attention this was receiving?
Yes and no. They kind of expressed that when we were like sequestered at the beginning, just that, there's a lot of like coverage about it. But one day, I guess to answer your question fully, they downplayed it a lot. I think they didn't want us to like worry too much, but like the security detail and all of that, I'm like, this seems just crazy. We couldn't even go on the elevators to the bottom floor without, cops with us. We couldn't have anyone else in the elevator with us. We couldn't talk to anyone else. It was very serious. But on the way home from the courthouse one day, we all of a sudden started going really, really fast. Like I'm talking like 90 miles per hour. And we're like, what the heck? And we just didn't know what happened. Like they don't tell us really anything. You can just tell that there's like a stressful something going on. And afterwards, they end up telling us, this was like, because it wasn't long before the end of the trial, but they told us at the end that it was some person and Jason and Jeremy, our bailiffs, they didn't have, what do you call it, like radios to like talk back and forth. They didn't know why we were going that fast at the time. They just go however fast the cop in front of them goes, and they were speeding, so they're following them. Well, what happened was they saw someone next to us. They said one of the cops saw that someone was trying to take pictures into our van. So they pulled that person over and took her phone and took it to Judge Goal. So she's on the side of the highway. They keep her there, take her phone to Judge Goal. Judge Goal looks through it. finds that she was just, she goes to school at IU and had just like been traveling through Delphi and saw, our vans and all the cops. Was like, what is that? And then like looked it up and saw what it was and was just telling her friends, but she didn't have like videos of us or anything.
So just to give you an idea, like jurors in every situation are a little bit different. When you're sequestered, first off, I think most jurors, an antenna will go up that's probably more serious, something going on. When you have this type of security detail, cops going everywhere to lunch and dinner with you, driving you places, things like this happening, from my perspective, it's a big deal, right? And as a juror who maybe has never done this before, I think she says the foreman had been on a juror before. From my perspective, it is a situation where they're going to know that it's serious. It's a situation where when officers are going to do something like this, like it's a pretty jarring thing for you to see. I wonder how they knew that the cell phone was confiscated and given to Judge Gohl. I don't know how they would have known something like that. If I was an attorney, I probably wouldn't have want them to know that. I would just want them to know the situation was handled, basically. But that heightened sense of what's going on. I mean, maybe there is outside public pressure, but if you think about it, you don't know which side is necessarily applying the pressure potentially if you're a juror on the case. But either way, she was just giving that, I think, as an example of an indication as to why she kind of understood this case is a big deal, or there is a lot of attention on this case. Okay, so we're going to listen here to a couple minutes now as she kind of describes what she thinks of Judge Gohl, what she thinks of the prosecutors, and what she thinks of the defense attorneys. And what's always interesting to me is every juror, I mean, they should and they better, loves the judge, thinks the world of the judge. And that's no different here. So no surprises here, regardless of what some people said. And I think even the podcaster said, they were a little annoyed with Judge Gohl because Judge Gohl wasn't giving the media everything they felt like they were entitled to. So regardless of that, from a juror's perspective, they almost always love the judge. There's no difference here. Number two is how she feels about the attorneys. And one of the most common thing, and I talked to another juror in the Chad Daybell case, and they told me that they felt the same way, that like the prosecutors were really organized and the defense felt like they were unorganized. And, they were told that after trial, Jamie said. Okay, I might have missed that. Jamie said that she was told that after trial. That makes more sense. So, and she's going to echo that the prosecutors were way more organized. The defense attorneys were way more unorganized. So we'll take a listen to a little bit of that here. Where did we go timestamp wise?
I'm sure like everything goes the way it's supposed to as well. We would do like a cookout. Our hotel had like grills outside, so Jason would grill sometimes, or we would like cater Subway or pizza, things like that.
Wow, that's okay. So I was always I'm like, what is their activity? So I think that's I think that's neat. I'm going to ask you about some of the different parties in the case and kind of what your impressions and what maybe sort of what you got the sense of the group's impressions of them were. And I guess that starting off one would be the one who probably kind of addressed you guys directly the most. And that's Judge Gohl.
I think that she is a very impressive woman. I don't know, ever since, I mean, in the way you look at a judge, at least to me, I was just like, wow, like she must be really like educated and I love seeing women in like a high role. So I thought that was really cool from the beginning. And then from my experience from the trial, once I heard the podcast, like I totally get where you guys are coming from like a media standpoint of wanting to, because I feel the same way. Like I'm so glad that you guys were able to be there the amount of times you were and get the correct message of what actually happened in court through. So I totally get your side, but as a juror, I didn't, experience any of that. And I just thought and think that she just like a boss, like, and did a really good job. I do think
it's really interesting too, to like read the comments and see people talking as we're listening. And like when there's a judge, there's been judges people love in the chat and judges people hate. I will just tell you, whether I love or hate a judge, it's not a lot of judges I hate, but whether I think a judge is awesome and fair or like one of the judges I don't love trying cases in front of, the sentiment is almost always the same with the jurors. And we can't blame the jurors for liking the judge. Everybody's respectful to the judge. All the lawyers should act in court like they like the judge, and they should be respectful to the judge. Jurors usually pick up on that. The judges give the jurors instructions. We always say, it's not just because the lawyers are going to tell you, the judge is going to tell you what the law is, and it's all very respectful, and that's how it works and how it's supposed to be. So every juror in almost every trial really likes the judge, and they really should.
Commands a room.
Yes. And I think we tried to stress on the show that while we still are certainly salty to a certain degree about the media stuff, I think she guided the case legally throughout a lot of minefields throughout the whole process. And I was impressed with that. And also she was so nice. Like, you could tell when she was addressing you guys, like she was so warm and kind of,
oh my God,
it was really nice. And like, I was curious, you kind of noticed that too.
Yeah. And after the trial, she always debriefed the jury. So we got to spend some time with her, and we're allowed to ask her any questions we want to. We just got to talk to her and actually spend normal time with her that's not just, in court. So that was really cool too.
What was she like during that?
Very chill, like not at all as I was expecting. She's very chill and cool and relaxed and just go with the flow, and not at all like you see her as a judge.
And then I'm curious, what were your impressions of the three attorneys from the prosecution? So I guess we can start off with McClelland. We talked a bit about him during voir dire, but during trial.
I was very, very impressed with McClelland. I think he did a really, really good job. And that's off of someone that, knows nothing about trials to this point. So, but knowing nothing, I think and I guess that's what really matters, because I was a juror, but I think I kind of touched on that he just made me feel comfortable, very professional. I think that was something that kind of lacked on the other side. Like, I felt that he always kind of had a plan, was always thoroughly prepared, just like a high level professional. I don't know, just kind of what you'd expect from a lawyer.
Right.
So that is a really, really common definition and sentiment of what jurors think for the lawyers that is on the side that they vote for. Like, I can't tell you how many times it was like the organization, the thoroughness, the way things are put together just seemed like your witnesses had more information. They were better prepared. The other side seemed unorganized. I wasn't really understanding what they were trying to get at. She did mention at another point that like the technology woes for the prosecution, was maybe not great. And they maybe thought like, oh, that's not very organized, that they're having these technology issues, which is why lawyers usually freak out and hate having technology issues during trial. That's why before trial, we're usually able to go to the courtroom, test out all of our technology, see how it works, have courtroom personnel there to help us with anything that might be an issue. I like to put up all my exhibits, anything I'm going to use in opening, anything I may use in jury selection, closing, whenever it is. Before I do that, I like to put it all up on the screen, make sure it works appropriately, because you hate to have this feeling, especially if you're the side that they think's really organized. Now you do something that makes them think you're less organized. It can affect the case. Now, it wasn't the ultimate issue. It wasn't the reason that she voted one way or the other, but that's what happens in the minds of the juries when you start to believe one side and go with one side throughout a trial, which is how trials work. You start to think, yeah, they're so organized. I trust them more. I believe them more. Not that you think one side is lying, but usually this is the sentiment a juror will echo for the lawyer whose side they vote for.
And then I guess the next one would be Stacey Diener on the prosecution side.
I really like Stacey Diener. Well, and something for me, I really like fashion, so it was really cool for me to look at everyone's outfits every day, and that was like something really cool about being in the courthouse for me for some reason. But she had the best outfits for sure. That was something I really liked about Stacey Diener.
Why are we like the same person? Because I was always saying the same thing. I kept telling Kevin, I'm like, she looks like one of the women from Law and Order. She's just like always very well put together.
And she didn't wear the same outfit twice, not once, which is pretty impressive.
I agree. And
on one end, very attentive. On another end, it makes me think there were parts of this trial that were probably a little bit slow, and they were noticing other things. And, the judge apologized for delays. And she noticed what people were watching and noticed that one of the lawyers didn't wear the same outfit the whole time. It's like, that's pretty wild to think that that was something that she noticed. Perceptive. Interesting.
Cut you off. I'm so sorry. What else were you going to say about Stacy Teener?
No, I didn't know this at the beginning when I didn't know that they like have planned who's going to cross and who's going to ask who the questions. Like, I didn't know they already knew who was going to talk to who, and it's like strategy. But I realized that a little bit as it went. The troll. Approachable in a sense, or I liked them. In all of their roles, I think they all did a really good job.
I want to go on to the defense. I guess Andrew Baldwin.
I liked him. More than Rosie, if we're comparing, I think he was more approachable in a sense, or just not as like intimidating. Because I don't know if Rosie was trying to, but he just always seemed like intimidating. Like, even because we don't like talk to these people or anything, but just even like making eye contact, you like try not to look him in the eye, But with Baldwin, we would make eye contact. I would smile, and I think he did a really good job. I would laugh sometimes with like his one question on each of the yellow pieces of paper, and we're flipping those over after we ask a question. That kind of I thought was funny sometimes, but he has a process and it works for him. So
yeah, those seed chapters or chapter seeds.
That's what he calls them.
Yeah,
well, you mentioned Brad Rosie. What did you think of him?
And I don't know if he's like the lead person or if it's like they both are, but it almost seemed like a ego thing too. I don't know, or maybe that's just the kind of person.
So she felt like Rosie had more of an ego. I think that's what kind of I was trying to get out earlier. And a lot of reports from inside the courtroom. And again, I wasn't inside there. So a lot of this is reacting just from a lawyer's perspective on when we talk to jurors, what we look for, what we don't, how we can get better, how we can't. Lawyers have certain personalities, styles, ways that they do things. And everybody kind of said that Rosie was more direct. Baldwin was a little friendlier. Rosie was a little more aggressive when he needed to be. Some people liked it. Some people didn't. And we say this about all sorts of lawyers. We said it when Emily and I were talking about Jay-Z and Jay-Z's lawyer Spyro, Tony Busby, whether we're talking about Alan Jackson, whether we're talking about Brennan. And, sometimes you guys like lawyers, you don't like lawyers, but the ones that have the direct and kind of control you personality, which is very common in trial lawyers, very common in successful trial lawyers. But we always talk about the fact that if a juror doesn't like you or they're not with you, as we say it, in trial law, if they're not with you, that can backfire. That can feel like an ego. That can feel condescending. And for Rosie's perspective, if that's his personality and that's his style, it's hard to change your style. If you're really a direct kind of bulldog, it's hard to be, a golden retriever in trial. And if you're a golden retriever, it's hard to be a bulldog. So you've got to learn when to tone it up, when to tone it down, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. But you also got to realize that when you lose, these are probably going to be I bet he's not surprised by these comments. I'll just say. And sometimes when you lose, you're going to get these comments. When you win, they're going to be like, we just believed everything he said. He controlled the courtroom. He controlled everything about it. He wouldn't let any witnesses wiggle out. We appreciated how hard he fought for his client. So it can be the same lawyer, just depending on which way it goes or depending on the trial, it can be very different reviews from the jurors. Let's see if there was any more I wanted to get to. We'll listen just a little bit more of this part.
As his ego just shows through, but like I said, he intimidating. I think it was from starting out on the let me dumb this down for you. Okay, so at least we know where we stand. And
I will just tell you, if you guys want to be upset about the juror, I understand. And a lot of people thinking that this was not the right verdict. I don't know. This was one I thought the whole time could go either way. And, we have people on that are pointing out some very serious problems that happened in the pretrial and leading up to it. But like I said, and like I asked every single person that came on, how many times do you have this many confessions? How many times do you have a situation where there's somebody that's as, beat down as Richard Allen was, and a lot of the things that were unfair prior to the trial and that are still going to be discussed and appealed and fought about, when you have a jury who doesn't know as much about the case and they hear all these confessions, I was thinking it could go either way. When you have an expert that thinks yeah, this is kind of junk science. I don't really agree with the way their methodology, but if you're a juror and this person sits on the stand and everybody says this person's an expert and they say, you match the bullet, I can understand how a jury got to a guilty verdict. I'm not saying that I think Richard Allen did it or that I think Richard Allen's innocent. I don't know. I don't have an opinion on that. I haven't been as closely involved in this case. I don't think the prosecution had enough to prove this case without the confessions of Richard Allen. I just don't think there was enough there. That's just me personally. But again, I was not sitting in the courtroom, so I don't even put a lot of stock in my own opinion in this case, which is why I like hearing from a juror. But what's really interesting coming in this interview is what pieces of evidence they kind of dismissed and yet still came to a guilty verdict. And that's still yet to come. One of the things she mentioned is like how at parts, they'd be like, how many of these cars existed? They didn't know. Then they went and found it and brought it back. It's like, how did you not already know that? I always think that's interesting. Same thing if you remember, like in Murdaugh, they didn't have the GMC data. And then the GMC data ends up showing up in the middle of the trial. What do jurors think? Well, in this case, they think, how did you not have that? And then here it is. That seemed easy enough to get to. Then they talk about the police interviews, which I found her comments on that to be very interesting in the jurors, or at least her view of the police interviews. So let's take a listen to that.
The prosecution's frequent issues with the large monitor screen also proved to be a source of consternation for the jury. They wanted to feel like their time was being used well, and those technological
concerns about Richard Allen's second interview with police.
Away from our families and jobs for so long, like our time is very valuable.
In this juror's mind, she also had...
All right, so there's people asking if I take into account the psychosis that he snapped. Yes, and I've talked about that a ton in a ton of podcasts. I'm not going to say there's not issues with these confessions. There's tons of issues with these confessions. That's not at all what I was saying, okay? Let's back up, okay? There's a different way to look at the case when we're going through it, we're reviewing it, we're hearing the evidence, we're hearing the issues, we're seeing what's going on pre-trial. There's a lot the judge kept out I didn't think she should have kept out. There's a lot of the way that the trial went that I did not think was necessarily fair for Richard Allen. There are major issues with the confessions. All that being said, you have to realize a juror sitting there not knowing anything, who's trying to make the biggest decision in Richard Allen's life and the victims' lives. And if the guy's sitting over there saying he did it, it's easier for us to sit here and pontificate and discuss on YouTube and podcasts like, well, maybe there was psychosis, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. But the jury's got to come down to the decision, and we have to respect their decision at the end of the day. We don't have to agree with it always, but to respect it, at least if they did the process and went through the process appropriately, which is what I want to listen to with this juror and see the process that they went through in their decision-making. Let's not turn this into like a fight in the chat about this juror being a bad person or some kind of plant or something like that, or how old or young or intelligent or unintelligent or whatever. Let's like we do with every juror interview. Let's take a listen. Did they go through the process appropriately? Did they weigh things appropriately? Did they discuss it? Did they follow the law? Is there any indication? That's really what I'm looking for. Okay. This is not going to be a situation where I trash this person or that person. That's not what this is going to be as far as the juror interview, but I'm really interested in what is their thought process. And there are some incredibly interesting revelations that she makes here coming up about what pieces of evidence they didn't really consider as being important.
Had concerns about Richard Allen's second interview with police, the one he did with Lieutenant Jerry Holman of the Indiana State Police. That was something that weighed on her mind.
Because I've listened to the podcast, so that when I hear what you guys said, I'm like, okay, well, that's true. But I just feel like he was very tough in the interview. It's realizing like that's how they're supposed to be. They're not supposed to, like interrogations are supposed to be walks in the park. That makes total sense. And at the end, and I'm sure we'll get into like deliberations and things, but that was one of the things that we rewatched as far as video evidence. We watched the interview, and so, you know, we were able to have discussion about him, and it was kind of mixed. Like, I think a lot of people were like, well, that's how they're supposed to be. Like, that's how.
And I believe these are the very animated interviews where people are, you know, the officers are yelling at him. and like berating him, and he doesn't break. He doesn't confess. There were certain parts where people thought maybe he was manipulating his wife in this situation. Other people who thought the fact that his wife was brought in showed that even more he didn't do this. And if he would have broken in this moment. And she's talking about how some of the jurors watched that and thought, yeah, that's how it is. But she didn't necessarily think that that's how it was. And she's going to make some other comments I find interesting here.
Interrogatories go. And for some reason, for me personally, the interview, I just thought, a guy that's never been in with the law before, and he didn't call for a lawyer. He clearly doesn't know what he's supposed to do, but he's not admitting to it. So I was like, the interviews to me just felt like he was just too calm and really didn't know anything to have done it.
That was her thought after listening to the police interviews. That this guy didn't know what he was doing. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, but he didn't confess. He didn't break. He remained calm. He didn't seem like someone who did it. I mean, that was what a lot of other people were saying as well that were coming on the channel and stuff. And I thought, this is somebody who voted guilty. Okay. But this is the way she viewed the interviews. And this is the way that she felt Richard Allen was acting in the interviews, not like an automatically guilty person. Thought that was incredibly interesting. Then she talks about the Westfield videos and the Westfield videos of the jail and how horrible it is. And she said she knows it's horrible and needs to be replaced. But she actually said, based on the description and some of the comments made, she was expecting it to be worse than what was shown on the video. Him being taken to get an x-ray, his face was black and blue, her head from him hitting his head against the wall. That to me was incredibly, incredibly interesting. That she thought, based on the explanation, which is why you always got to be careful and you never know exactly how a video is going to play to a jury, but she was expecting it to be much worse. Interesting. She also keeps saying that she was playing devil's advocate. She was giving the defense credence. And the podcast hosts compliment her on that and say that's what the jurors are supposed to do. So she was saying she was staying in it. She was not going to jump to any conclusions, and she was not an immediate guilty vote when they went back there to vote. Kay Schmidt said, think it's much of a factor. The jurors could deliberate daily and likely bonded in some way. It could be. And we kind of talked about this with some of the other guests I had on. It's unusual from my perspective, not unusual for Indiana, I guess, for them to be able to do this. I think it can change the dynamic to where they start deliberating before the defense has even cross-examined a witness, obviously before the defense has put on any case or any arguments, and just they could come to their conclusion way too early in the case when just the state has put on its case, which is why every defense attorney is like, wait, give us a chance. Wait until we actually put on our case. Christy said, thanks for always being level-headed and fair, Peter. I mean, listen, when it comes to something like this, when people disagree, sometimes they can get so far entrenched on one side that everybody else kind of looks like they're against them. I'm not against anybody. Okay. I'm not against anybody. I just 100%, I want a just outcome. I don't necessarily know what that is in this case. From what I was hearing and what I was reading, it didn't necessarily seem like a fair process, but I wasn't there. Okay. This juror was there. And I know that people are sometimes going to disagree with jurors, and that's okay. And we can, but we have to realize the juror doesn't know everything that everybody else might either know or is saying, or maybe some stuff is true, isn't true. Maybe the juror was confused. Maybe we're confused. I don't know. Right. So I'm going to respect this person's opinion. They sat through the trial. They reviewed the evidence, and it seems like they weighed it. Curious said, imagine how much Richard Allen is traded for in Westville. Oh gosh. Is it possible sequestration invites a different kind of bias, even if unintentional? For example, when the state is providing meals/days off fun. So I don't know, but I don't know if there's ever been a case where the defense doesn't want a jury sequestered. Most of the sequestration motions are filed by defense. Most of the time, the defense isn't the one objecting. And if they are, they probably have a pretty good reason for it. So I don't know the answer to that. Question, Peter, do you think the U.S. jury system needs to be overhauled and reformed? If so, how would you do it? Suggestions. So no, I wouldn't say overhauled and reformed. I think it's a very difficult process to do fairly. I don't know if, I mean, again, some people could disagree with this. I would have to take some time to think about this, right? If I was the czar and if I was the jury trial czar and could wave my wand and fix something. I kind of think more transparency. I don't know. I could see how more transparency could be good and more transparency could be bad, right? Where maybe we do know what happens in jury deliberation. So if they just go rogue and don't follow the law, we can do something for justice. But then again, would that create pressure and force them to do something that they think the public would want them to do, or be too scared to do what they think is right and where they think the law points, right? This is something that I can't just come up with on the top of my head, but I know that a lot of reform has already happened, and it's the best system in the world, in my opinion, even though it's not perfect. All right. In part two, they talk a lot about how professionalism went a long way with the witnesses, and they really liked some of the state witnesses. They did talk about the state expert, and she specifically, this juror said she didn't think the state expert was lying about the bullet stuff, but she did not believe the evidence was exact. And she said she knows the defense expert maybe used pictures and shouldn't have done it that way, but she really did not consider the bullet much, if at all, in her deliberations, which clearly giving props to the defense on how they handled that piece of evidence, which, remember that now, as we're going to listen to what she talks about in her deliberations, she's saying they didn't really consider the bullet. Okay. And they still got to a unanimous guilty verdict. Interesting. She said they sat down, started out by making a timeline. They didn't do a vote that day. The first time they voted, it was 9-3, guilty 2, undecided. The juror foreman they voted on, she didn't vote for him, but she thinks he did a good job. Was the one who had been a juror before and was kind of controlling the process a little bit. And then they start talking about the confessions, and they'll get more into the confessions, but she says that they truly were considering psychosis when discussing the confessions. And to me, that's a good thing. That means the defense put on the proper argument. The jury heard the argument. The jury is really in a position where you hear somebody confess, you hear an argument that says it was psychosis, it wasn't a true confession. What are you supposed to do? Are you just supposed to listen to the defense and throw it out? No. You're not just supposed to listen to the defense, listen to a doctor that says, yeah, it was psychosis. Be like, okay, throwing out all these confessions. No. You're supposed to consider the psychosis, consider the context, and then consider that maybe the confessions are real. And from her explanation, is she telling the truth? Is she not? I'm not going to get into that. But what she says is they did consider the psychosis. She also decided she's going to law school, this juror, because of this case. Found that to be interesting. Okay, now we're going to jump to kind of the bulk of her description and discussion about what they did in deliberations.
If you're like
what they didn't consider, what was important.
I respect it on some level, even though it kind of looks ridiculous from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, yeah, it does look ridiculous to some extent on the outside, but there is an important principle at stake. You really don't want to have a situation where we allow in this country for people to have charges filed against them before the case is ready, and they have to deal with this indefinitely for extended periods of time.
And on an assumption.
Whoops, I clicked the wrong one. I was like, that's not it. All right, hold on a second.
If you're like,
what is it? All right, here we go.
Like a time where like, okay, like we're soon all gonna vote the same, you know. There wasn't a point where it felt like that. So like we went through.
So she's going to talk about deliberations, but she does say it didn't feel like they were going to get to a point where they were all going to actually vote the same, because the 9-3, it was 8-4 at some point, and it didn't really seem like it was going to get there. Rose said, do you know what type of lawyer the host of MS is? Curious. I don't know. I don't know that answer. I don't know that answer, but maybe I can find out, and I'll look into them a little bit.
All the confessions, things like that. This is that Friday, sorry. We took the break. The rest of the day we spent discussing things and our opinions. And that was the hard part, difficult part sometimes. Some people just aren't the best at working with groups. So people talking over others, things like that. We went through that a little bit. A lot of Tuesday was just seemed to be like just a lot of talking and consideration. That was the day we took a vote at the end, and it was 3 undecided, 9 guilty. So that day we decided on Friday, we're going to need to see, they wanted us to let them know if we're going to need to see video evidence like ahead of time, because they had to get both counsels in there, the judge, all of that, and then however long it would take Mullen to get it up on the screen. So all things considered, they wanted us to give a day in advance. So we then just said, well, let's figure out, what we're wanting to see video-wise and kind of go from there. So we decided we wanted to watch both of the interviews again, mainly Holman, I think. Or no, I think they mainly wanted to see Mullen. I wish I could remember why. There was something specific in the interview they wanted to see again. And then we also watched the video, the Bridge Guy video, that was edited or remastered or whatever they did to where, so it stays upright and whatnot. And then there was one that it was just the audio of the Bridge Guy video.
You mentioned that you had some issues with that interrogation or interview video with Holman and Allen that played out during the deliberation process. Can you walk us through some of that?
So again, having no experience on seeing really interrogations or any experience with that kind of thing, I felt especially Holman, he just kept going at him and going at him and going at him. And even though he said, I'm done, which granted, why don't you just get up and walk out? But I was just putting myself in that position as if I was being asked those questions and I didn't know how that got there, how am I going to explain, how it did if I don't know? So I just felt like it was overdone in a sense, but I mean, that's just coming from me,
What did you make of the confessions? You said that was one of the areas that you kind of took a lead on.
Yeah. Of course, what stands out to everyone is the van. And that's part of the deliberations that, let me see. So Saturday, we pretty much watched all of the video evidence, and that's all we had time for. We even stayed late because the videos were pretty long, it being a half day. So we didn't really have much of a discussion that day, but we did take a vote after we watched all the videos. And there was that day 8 guilty and 4 undecided.
So after they watched all the videos, one person went from guilty to undecided. Now, the defense lawyer in me wants to say that's not guilty, right? If you're undecided and the state hasn't proven it, that's not guilty. That's 4 not guilty votes, but I won't say that. But that's interesting, right? They watch the videos and one shifts to undecided. And she's going to talk a little bit here about how the foreman said the undecided people need to go home, make a list of all your issues, evidence you believe, what you don't believe, things like that. They come back, discuss it, and then eventually they get to guilty. We're going to listen to her explain that. But that's why I always talk about in trial, closing arguments are not always or really where lawyers win or lose a case. Instead, closing arguments are where lawyers arm the jurors that are with them to go back and argue on their behalf back there for justice. That's what the lawyers believe they're fighting for on their side. So what they believe justice to be, they arm the jurors that believe in their justice. They go back and they argue with the other jurors. They push the undecided jurors into their camp, right? That's not wrong. When a juror's like, I'm not sure about this shit. Well, remember, there was this piece of evidence and the lawyer said, this is what that piece of evidence shows. Let's look at that piece of evidence and see if we agree if that's what it shows. And it sounds like that's exactly what happened in this case with the 8 or 9 guilty votes and the 3 or 4 undecided, that the 8 or 9 guilty were answering all of their questions, giving them the evidence to fill the gaps. Now, another thing lawyers ask in jury selection is, if you feel like this is not guilty, will you stand on business? I think somebody says that in one of these interviews. Will you stand on business? Will you stand up there? Are you afraid to be the only one person that stands up there and sticks to whatever you think your verdict is? And usually we will only pick jurors that say yes to that, because if a juror says no to that, usually that's a cause challenge and they'll be struck and we don't have to use a preemptory strike for it. So if you're undecided and you don't think there's enough there, and that means you're a not guilty vote and you're resolute in that, you shouldn't be switched. You shouldn't be flipped. But it's not wrong for the other jurors to come and say, this is what I believe. This is what I think the evidence shows. That's what closing arguments are supposed to do to jurors, is arm those jurors with the information they need to go back there and deliberate.
So you went from 9 to 3 to 8 to 4.
Yes. So clearly, someone else felt that way about the videos, the interrogation. The benefit.
And she said someone else, meaning she is one of the undecided. And later she said, so he told the undecided to do this. So we went back and did this. So she is one of the undecided voters at certain points.
Of that being Saturday, we had like a whole weekend to really think about it, like on our own, just really. And that's what I did. I went straight home. I wrote pages upon pages in my journal. I narrowed it down to like, what do I know for fact and what do I believe? And then, are those things enough to warrant unreasonable doubt? And that's kind of what I pondered that whole weekend. So I think that really benefited us, having that, and then going back Monday. So to go back to the confessions, one of my things that I had that stood out to me in a sense of thinking that he could be guilty is the mention of the van. Outside of that, I didn't put really any weight to anything else, although it is very eerie. And looking back, I think, like, who would confess that many times that didn't actually do that? Like, I can't think of how that would ever happen. But again, it's really hard when you're asked to, like, it's not just something that's no big deal if you get it wrong. There's a lot of weight to it. So
yeah, I'm really struck with the thoughtfulness that you put into this, and what you're saying makes so much sense. Like, yes, we can all sit here now and say that's an awful lot of times to confess, but
right,
you don't, even if there's a slight issue with that, you need to set it aside and focus on the things that matter more, I guess.
So those types of comments, listen, jurors are not going to be perfect. Jurors are not going to be able to explain the law like a lawyer. So let's not pretend like that's how they should be able to explain the law. But I don't mind the logic of, if I'm not positive about something, and she uses terms like, beyond the shadow of a doubt, even, I think she said, and she's like, okay, I want to take that out and see if it still makes sense. See if the timeline still makes sense. See if I'd be able to vote guilty. I don't think a lot of people would have a problem, especially defense attorneys. I don't think that a lot of people would have a problem with that thought process, right? Now, I don't know how they filled those gaps or filled those holes. I don't know what evidence they felt was so overwhelming at certain points. So we're going to keep listening. But the way that she explains it, I think, is thoughtful. I think that is a good way to think about it, that if you're not sure about something, or you don't think something is, for sure proven, you shouldn't put it into your analysis, and the state should still have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, even without certain points.
I have written in here, there was at least one person, I don't know if there were more, but posing the question of, well, if it wasn't Richard Allen, then who could it have possibly been? There wasn't anyone else wearing those clothes. There wasn't.
So if it wasn't Richard Allen, who could it have possibly been? That's one of the questions the defense wanted to try to answer, right? In providing alternate suspects, and providing maybe some more information about those alternate suspects, and they weren't able to. Now, again, what she says she does with this information is, maybe that's not the right question. Like, if it wasn't Richard Allen, then who was it? And I agree with her. That's not the right question. The question is, did the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Richard Allen?
Anyone else that, seems suspicious. And where I was at, it just seems like a wrong question to ask, because that's not what this is about. We're not seeing if it could be anyone else. Is there enough evidence showing that it's him specifically? Not, is there other evidence showing that it could have been someone else? So I really tried to just focus on the mission. at some point someone alluded to, we don't need to make a decision out of sympathy, portraying the people that are undecided just feel bad. And that really got me that day.
There were some other things that this juror kept coming back to.
So the guilty starts pressuring the undecided with, you just feel bad, sympathy's not supposed to do it. Where on one side, people be like, that's inappropriate, they shouldn't. It's like, well, the lawyers, the judge, the jury instructor said sympathy is not how you're supposed to make your decision. So if they were making their decision based on sympathy, that is not following the law, right? Now, how did those discussions exactly happen? We don't know. Spicy said, Peter, being a juror is part of our responsibility as citizens. Judge Gohl graduated from Valpo Law School, which has been closed by the state of Indiana due to their subpar curriculum. Valpo equals the ITT of the law world. I don't know. I can't comment on that. I don't have any. There's a lot of reasons law school was closed, by the way. I know you said the reason here is because it was subpar. I don't know. I don't know that to be true. I have no comment. AKDO said, does lawyer actually read this chat? Yes, and sometimes it feels unfortunate that I read it all. Like usually it's awesome. That's the best part about YouTube is reading the chat. But on days like today, I'll interact a little bit less because I do this so we can try to learn from each other. I can learn from you. You can learn from me. And it's something that's supposed to be a decent part of our day, right? We deal with tough topics, so it's not always happy. It's not always fun. But I like to learn. I like to discuss. I like to get your opinions. And I like to interact with the chat, but some days it's less fun. So we'll interact as much as we can with the chat. But I really only want to bring things that are really something we can learn from, that are respectful, even if you disagree. And I know some people don't like that. I like to hear differing opinions and differing views on our channel and discuss why they are thinking the way that they are.
So I know one of them was Rayleigh Voorhees saw Richard Allen. Richard Allen saw Rayleigh Voorhees. Richard Allen said he was there at bedtime window. He said what he was.
So in this section, she goes through how basically it sounds like she also doesn't just throw out the bullet, but she throws out the confessions, yet she still brings in the van. And she is saying that like the timeline, he's putting himself there in those clothes. She's talking about, police interviews and discussions and, the statements that he gave, not the confessions. Which again, I think is so interesting that she's saying she got to a guilty verdict and the confessions and the bullet evidence were not the two biggest pieces of evidence. And that just makes me dead wrong, because I thought any juror that was going to convict Richard Allen would look at it and be like, the expert said it was his bullet. So that puts him there with a gun, which goes with the state's theory. And he confessed. He said he did X, Y, and Z, and he knew things he shouldn't have known. Right? I know there are reasons you can get to how he did know them. I know about the psychosis, but I'm saying if a juror got there, I would have thought those would be the two biggest pieces of evidence. And she says they weren't for her, which on one hand makes me think, wow. So the two things that the defense had the biggest problem and argument with, she's like, we didn't even need to consider those and we still got to guilty. Seems interesting. Interesting is my favorite word today. And number two, the timeline and where he said he was and the clothing and things like that, those are kind of the only pieces she really puts into place to where that was enough for the state to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt to get her to a guilty verdict. And every juror is different. So some other juror could come and say, no, it was the confessions. No, it was the bullet. So just because this is how she got there, it was very clear that all these jurors were getting there different ways. And that's why you don't have to have only one way to get to guilty. Whatever it is, the evidence that you think proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, you can vote guilty as a juror.
Swearing, it was the same that closes bridge guy. So once you get to that, there's really no disputing that Richard Allen is bridge guy. That's what I think we got to first. So
timeline, clothes, and he puts himself there. There's no disputing that he is bridge guy. Again, I think that's good lawyering by the state, good lawyering by the prosecution. That's their theory. That's what they were putting forward. That's what they were trying to prove. And she agreed with them. I think the defense would say there's absolutely a dispute that was Richard Allen. There's absolutely a dispute with the timeline. There's absolutely a dispute. It could have been multiple or at least one other man, similar build, dressed that way with those clothes. The defense, I think, would dispute it. She says it's indisputable.
Does anyone disagree that Richard Allen's bridge guy. And no one did. You really can't. So
no one disagreed. No one did. You really can't. That's how the jury got there. And I think, I don't know this to be a fact, but I think some people would say the defense might not even dispute that bridge guy committed the crime, but they say Richard Allen wasn't bridge guy. Some people might say that. I'm not saying that's what the defense said. I'm not saying that's a guarantee, but they said we locked in. Nobody could argue Richard Allen was bridge guy. And that was the first step, obviously, in getting to guilty.
If he's bridge guy, how do we know if he was the kidnapper and murderer? Which, after realizing he's bridge guy, was pretty easy to add all of those things together. But really just things that he reported himself is really what got me closer to guilty.
Sounded like the timeline was perhaps more important than any of this sort of flashier confessions, maybe with the exception of the van.
Absolutely.
And you said you didn't even take the bullet into consideration because of your doubts about the science.
Yep.
Objection leading. But I think, listen, they basically, she said, let's take out two of the flashier items, the bullet argument and the confession. Timeline was enough. Richard Allen reporting himself was enough, with the exception of the van, which is a pretty big part that came out in the confessions. And if you threw the confessions out, you kind of got to throw the van part out too, right? But this is where this juror is.
I'm curious, you mentioned kind of people kind of getting a little bit on each other's nerves. Like, did it get heated? How did people come back from that?
It was a lot more relaxed than I thought it would be. I thought there would be a lot more turmoil than there was. There's really just one time where not everyone was getting a chance to talk. Like when you have a big group of people, there's certain people that talk most of the time. And we were running into that. And it's like, we need everyone to have discussion, So after that was pretty much it. And there wasn't really any hard feelings. I mean, we all realized that we're totally random people, we're not friends. And we're stuck in this hotel together like for so long, and we're around each other all the time. It's the only people we see. Like, of course, there's going to be a little bit of something, feelings. But outside of that, it's a total different relationship because it would be hard to be on top of someone that you don't really know and constantly be around them and have discussions with them. In general. So, even if it was, your spouse. So we realized, we're around each other a lot. We're probably going to have feelings. But now that we're not in that situation, our feelings for each other are a lot different.
That makes so much sense.
And you're able to separate that.
Yeah, it's like the heat of the moment.
Exactly. We're pretty cordial, really, most of the time.
And usually, the more cordial a jury is, the more likely they are to kind of come together. If you really do get angry and you get ego and you start to hate these people usually dig their heels in more. I think we heard some of that in the YNW Melly case that ended in a mistrial.
What was the feeling like in the room when you realized, wait, we're unanimous now?
Oh my God. Yeah. So I have a lot to say about that. That Monday was the best deliberation discussion day we had. We, again, like I said, we had the weekend. So I know, at least for me, I had the points that that I know for a fact that I believe evidence-wise. And essentially the people that were undecided, our foreman wanted us to make a list of what we do know and what we do believe. So we did that. We wrote down those different points. And then
this is where the foreman basically over the weekend was like, write this stuff down, bring it in. And then Monday is when they had their best deliberation discussion day, also the day where they ended up getting unanimous guilty votes.
And we had a discussion, and we did the opposite too of what don't we believe? And like I said before, does that affect that there's still a possibility that Richard Allen is guilty, or, do we need to have a discussion about it to see, where it really stands? So, the bullet and those kind of things. But yeah, we had just an open discussion. The people that thought he was guilty had discussion with us people that thought undecided. And then we decided to take a vote. After I heard the first few guilties, I just knew. Once the last one was read, our foreman couldn't believe it. He was like, "Are you serious?"
So they were even surprised. After all that time, undecided votes came over. And what I will say is, we're at an hour mark. I just want to listen to maybe one more minute her talk about some of the YouTube coverage on this. Again, if you disagree with their verdict, that's fine. This was a case where I could see a jury going either way. And like I said, I have not seen a lot of cases where you have this many confessions where it comes out not guilty. That would have been some beating astronomical odds. And I said that when Andrea Burkhart and lawyer Lee and Bob from Defense Diaries were all on, who all I think were leaning not guilty, some even leaning toward the innocent camp. And I also think, I don't have time, nor do I have the detailed explanations that they do, that maybe this podcast does, where if you think the timeline was off and you think, the third party culprit defense would have been really good, they all break that down in detail. Especially I think Andrea Burkhart went through the timeline and how it's way off and how it doesn't fit. And if you want to argue facts with this juror and do that, then that's fine. And you can listen to that podcast. And I encourage you to, and say, wow, if this juror really put the utmost, because that's basically the end of the interview. That's basically the end of the details. So she didn't take the bullet into account. She didn't take the confession into account. She still got to the fact that Richard Allen was bridge guy, basically because of, his initial comments, not his confessions, but initial comments either in the report or the police discussion interrogation, and the timeline that the state put forward. So again, I wasn't in the trial, but the defense seems like they did a good job, at least for this juror, in hitting the confessions and hitting the bullet. Maybe not a good enough job on the timeline, or maybe they did do a good job on the timeline. It just didn't stick with this juror. And maybe again, the confessions did it for another juror. But this is a good example how sometimes we don't understand. Sometimes we don't think it's enough. Sometimes the juror thinks it's enough. That's why beyond a reasonable doubt is such a hard standard to explain. And it's difficult to get a jury to understand. And it seems like there are even parts where, the undecideds did have reasonable doubts. They didn't believe certain confessions. They didn't believe the bullet evidence. Many jurors would vote not guilty just because of that. Because of those doubts, because of that indecision. And I would argue that is the true definition of beyond a reasonable doubt. Not like, well, I guess if it wasn't him, who really could it be? I can't figure out who else it could be, so I'm going to vote guilty for that. So I can understand that explanation for it as well. Now, she does say that there was a bunch of inaccurate YouTube coverage. So I wanted to play that here at the end. I have no idea what she was talking about. She doesn't actually say who she was talking about. Could be me. I don't know. And she does say people that were not in the courtroom. I was not in the courtroom. But I honestly, this trial was interesting for me because I feel like this is why it's difficult to cover cases when you can't watch them. This is why it's difficult to cover cases when you can't stream them, because it's hard for me to push back against some of the factual discrepancies. I can hear one person say it's so clear the facts say this. I can hear one person say it's so clear the facts say that. I can disagree. I can say that's not enough for me. I can say the way you told me the facts, it doesn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to me. But it's different than when I get to watch the whole trial, because I feel pretty confident and resolute in a lot of my positions, even though sometimes I say this is my position, but wouldn't surprise me if the jury does something else. So let's listen to hear what she says about the inaccuracies on YouTube.
Individual creators.
People saying like Judge Gull telling people things that didn't actually happen, or I saw things of the jurors, there were jurors crying and doing this and that, which was so inaccurate. I don't know. It's the general. I listened to your guys' podcast from start to finish, and that's about all I've read some articles, which they're more the stuff I see article wise and on social media, outside of videos and podcasts and things, they're more just attention grabbing. So they're more dramatized, I guess. Not necessarily incorrect, but they just make it sound way more intense than it really was. Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for listening to all of our episodes.
Yeah.
That was a lot of hours.
A lot of rambling.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, it took me a while, and I think you guys did a really, really good job of.
All right. So yeah, clearly she listens to their podcast. She chose to go on to their podcast and kind of discuss all of this. I don't also, let me just say this to be clear. I don't blame her for, if she thought that they broke down the case the right way and saw it the right way. I do not blame her for going on the podcast. I don't expect her to go on a hostile podcast. Not that I think any of the lawyers that disagreed with her would be a hostile podcast. I would hope that they wouldn't, and I don't think they would. All of the people I talked to were not hostile at all. And again, I think they all broke it down in a fair way. I think that they saw it a certain way, explained it a certain way, but all of them in my discussions with them, I thought understand that there were issues and there were things about this case that were a reason we were here. But I also think it's really hard for lawyers, including myself, to get over when we see mistreatment, trying to kick lawyers off the case that really want to fight for a client totally in an inappropriate way that even the Supreme Court justices saw it that way. A client clearly having a mental break throughout the process. It's really hard to get over that stuff. But yeah, I think that this case brought out a lot of difficult emotions. I appreciate jurors so much for what they do. I also appreciate when they speak out. It's very rare that I don't know if I've ever just smashed a juror who has come out and said something publicly. I can disagree with them. I can say, I don't think that's how it's supposed to. I could say this could be appellate issues potentially. We even had a case, I think it was Lori Vallow or Chad Daybell, where one of the interviews with Nate Eaton came up as one of the motion for new trial or appellate issues. And that can't happen. Some of the jurors speaking out in the Murdaugh case has created, what we have going on there and shedding some light and telling us what is going on is a good thing. We learn more, we understand more, we can see if there were problems. We can have our freedom of speech to say, I agree with that, I disagree with that. And if we lose that and people think that they can bully you into saying, or, shame you into not coming out and saying, I agree with this, I disagree with that. Like from my perspective and I don't even put whatever stock into this you want. From the secondhand nature that I heard this case, it didn't seem like just the timeline should be enough for a guilty verdict. But I wasn't a juror. She was a juror. It was enough for her. It was enough to get her guilty vote. It was enough to get her to believe Richard Allen did this beyond a reasonable doubt. And what she said is she was considerate. She thought about it. She gave credence to the defense arguments. She gave them the benefit of the doubt. She played devil's advocate. She was skeptical. And she didn't even consider the confessions and the bullet, which I find just unbelievable. Still got to a guilty verdict. And this is the jury system. And for everybody that hates the jury system, one of the other systems we could use is just let the judge decide. What do you think the judge would have decided in this case? Who do you think was better? Who do you think gave Richard Allen a fairer shake? If it would have been a bench trial with Judge Gohl or this jury? Not perfect, but full credit to the juror for coming forward. I agree. The juror stated they broke into smaller groups. Is this normal? Is this a potential issue for jury nullification? So when jurors say they do things like break into small groups, it's hard to comment on because I don't know if they mean in the same room where they all were just like, okay, you three go over there and you look at this evidence is kind of what she said. You go over there, you look at this evidence. That's like the sacred part of the jury deliberations. They're allowed to come back and say, okay, us three looked at this. This is what we saw. We three looked at this. This is what we saw. We go through it. This is what I have an issue on. This is what I don't. I don't think they broke up into separate rooms, although I have seen jurisdictions that do allow that. It's hard for me to know what she meant specifically by breaking up into smaller groups. Is this a potential issue for jury nullification? No, jury nullification happens at trial, like you ask for the jury to disregard the law, basically. Could what she is saying be used in appeal, i.e. who else could have been when the defense wasn't allowed to bring that in? I would cite it. Some appellate courts won't really consider it because it's not part of the trial. But if I'm making an argument saying we should have been able to provide this third-party defense, even one of the jurors is like, who else could it have been? That echoes our issue. I think it can be used as argument, but it's not part of the court record. As to my previous question on jury system reform, and my theory is that social media gets info out there so quick, it's hard to find people who literally know nothing about any high-profile cases before. It's hard to find people who literally know nothing about any high-profile case beforehand. So, Belinda, I tend to agree with you, especially in certain age groups, but I am surprised when I talk to people and they have no idea what I'm talking about when I say maybe the Johnny Depp case, I think every single person I've ever talked to knows what I'm talking about. Tons of people don't know what Murdaugh is, don't know what Karen Reed is, don't know what Koberger is. Like tons of people. And I'm always surprised. And I'm like, oh, I guess you're just a normal person, unlike myself. And I do think that those people do exist. And I think that they usually are the ones that end up on juries. But I do think you can be into true crime and maybe not pay attention to some local case that's not high profile, and you could be perfect for that jury as well. Because not every case is a high profile case. And even if you know about all the high profile case, you're not going to know about your truck accident case where some pedestrian was hit by a drunk truck driver who was driving too many hours. You're probably not going to know about that case, but you know a lot about the law and about trials, and you watch that and you go sit on that jury. Be perfect for that jury. Peter, when is the members only chat? I don't know. We're going to have to schedule that, John. And we are going to have some Cowboys something behind us. Either maybe we'll put some Cowboy stuff up on that screen, maybe some highlights or something, because Rebecca did win our Lawyer Fantasy Football League. She beat me in the finals like a drum, I might add, dominated most of the season. So she deserved it. Congratulations, Rebecca, on that. Okay. It's a tough one in the chat. Let's remember to keep vibes high and respectful and considerate. You may disagree with me even. I know it happens. And I know people get disappointed when they disagree with me. And while I don't like to disappoint people, I've got to say what I think is true and what I believe and how I see things and how I break them down and try to add value to them from my perspective. Hopefully that happened today, whether you agreed or disagreed. I appreciate every one of you coming and joining along. Hit that like button if you have not already. Till next time, I'm out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And don't forget to check out the Lawyer You Know podcast with new seasons dropping every quarter. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, The Lawyer You Know.